The carousel, merry-go-round, or roundabout is generally considered the original amusement ride. The modern version of the ride can be found in thousands of locations worldwide, ranging from amusement parks, museums, zoos, and even cruise ships. It's simply the most recognizable and significant ride ever created. But a ride as old as the merry-go-round has a rich and deep history, and the rides that we call merry-go-rounds today have changed significantly over time.
The origin of the carousel is credited to a game which seems to have started around the year 1000. In this game, two knights would ride in a circle and toss a ball between two of them. This required great skill and was used more as a training exercise before battle. The word carousel comes from the Italian word carosella, which roughly translates to little battle. The game evolved in the 1600s. Now riders on horseback would attempt to spear metal rings while riding. This became a bit of a public spectacle in mainland Europe, and eventually became popular enough that some operations were set up where members of the public could try the game for themselves. Around this time, wooden models of horses began appearing for children to pretend to play the game. In the 1700s, a small industry began to be formed around these attractions. This consisted of what we would now call showman family traveling with attractions and shows by wagon train around Europe. The oldest variation of the modern carousel was born at this time, the live carousel. This consists of real live animals, usually horses or ponies, walking in a circle around a set track together. Some attractions like this do still exist today. This progressed over the next few years into things that seem more like rides to us. The first of these would consist of wooden animals hung from chains, ropes, or wooden poles connected to a center structure. Animals or people would then be used to spin the device, causing riders to swing out to the sides of the attraction. A description of one of these rides exists from 1803. It describes a ride designed by John Joseph Merlin, an inventor from the Holy Roman Empire who set up one of his rides in the Mechanical Museum of London. It's written that the horses floated freely over a pole, and it was connected to a big musical instrument that played a fully orchestrated concerto. From the first note, it was said that the carousel would start turning while each horse would make a galloping movement with a visitor on its back. The carousel would continue development through the 1800s alongside a growth in the amount of leisure time available to the common person. The first record of steam-powered carousels comes from 1861. In this era, carousel-style rides were the amusement rides. So many steam-powered versions were known to run very fast compared to contemporary carousels. In fact, it wouldn't be until the 1930s and 40s that carousels started to transition into more kid-friendly rides. An English reporter in 1863 described one of these steam-powered carousels as, quote, "a roundabout of huge proportions, driven by a steam engine which whirled around with such impetuosity that the wonder is the daring riders are not shot off like a cannonball, and driven half into the middle of next month." These steam-powered carousels were the highlights of any fair they attended, much like the large pendulum rides are today, and they required quite a team and equipment to transport. In this era, English engineer Frederick Savage made several contributions to amusement ride and carousel development. One of his creations was the Sea on Land, a ride mentioned in the Matterhorn video, as this marked the point where the history of carousels and Matterhorn/Himalaya rides split. The Sea on Land was a fast-paced ride that featured boat ride vehicles. Under the boats was a crank mechanism that caused the boats to tip and rock as if they were on the sea. His company would also place this design with the cranks under the rider's seats on normal carousels featuring horses. This type of carousel is known as a galloper, and a few examples still exist today. Savage's company pioneered other advancements, such as a swinging mechanism so horses could swing out with centripetal motion. His carousels were also some of the first to feature fairground organs, or band organs as they are known in the US. These organs also have quite the history themselves. The first fairground organs appeared in the early 1800s and were driven with a hand crank. Their design was similar to that of a music box, where a rotating drum would interact with metal pins, producing sound. These organs were designed to be loud, so they could be heard over the sound of crowds and fairground machinery. Much like modern fairground music, they were designed to attract people and keep them interested. Later versions of the fairground organ would work by having a steam or electrically driven bellows that blew air through holes in a paper scroll. This works very similarly to a player piano.
Now, many of these later organs were designed to be run on electricity. That is the case with this example here at the Merry-Go-Round Museum. Now, many amusement park organs were modified later on to run digitally, often using MIDI files such as the ones you've been hearing throughout this video. This one here at the museum, though, still runs with its original paper roll design.
The modern carousel we know today was not born in Europe, though. Instead, it would be immigrants in the USA who would bring the carousel into the modern era. One immigrant, a German named Gustav Denzel, would essentially bring the carousel to the United States and by virtue is responsible for the birth of amusement rides in the country. Denzel was born in Prussia in 1848. He would travel with his dad, who operated a portable carousel. This was a very early example of the German traveling showman families that are so well known today. He would learn wood carving and be sent by his family to the US. Once here, he started traveling with a homemade carousel. It was so popular that he founded a company to produce them. The Merry-Go-Round Museum actually has the original sign from the Denzel shop. If you look closely, you can actually see the painted over word cabinet. This is because he originally went into business creating cabinets before carousels became popular. Before the company was sold to Philadelphia Toboggan Company in 1928, it's believed that over 150 carousels would be produced by them.
It would be Denzel's company in the late 1800s that would bring the carousel mainstream with its modern design. Denzel's design, seen on this Alan Herschel model, consists of a crankshaft connected to each horse and back to a gear near the center pole. It's then rotated by the motion of the ride, causing the connected horses to gallop. This design can also be made with a balance section so that horses nearby those that are galloping do not gallop at all. Alternatively, it could be made with a shorter crankshaft, so that way the horses on the outside of the ride did not gallop at all. That's the configuration these two Denzel horses were originally in on their original ride.
The American carousel also turns clockwise rather than counterclockwise as commonly seen in Europe. It would be this general mechanical design that would stick and become the carousel we are all most familiar with today.
The general mechanical design of this version of the carousel can be compared to that of an umbrella. The carousel consists of a center pole supported by an A-frame. The center pole suspends the rest of the ride. Outwards from the center pole are the sweeps. These extend outwards from the center pole to the edges of the ride. Attached to them at the top of the ride are decorative rounding boards. Often these feature shields as added decoration. Suspended from the sweeps are drop rods that hold up the platform. Often braces are used for extra support. On the platform itself can be a variety of places for riders. These can include chariots, which seat multiple people and do not move up and down, standers, which are animals that do not move up and down, and jumpers, which are animals that do move up and down. Traveling carousels also feature mud stills. These are basically just poles that stick outwards from the A-frame and center pole. They help support the ride when it's set up in muddy locations. The entire machine is driven near the center pole, and the operator may be stationed in the middle of the ride or outside of it. Some people have claimed that there is a difference between a carousel and a merry-go-round. After looking back at the historical record and asking experts at this museum and the New England Museum, it seems that this was really just down to semantics and there's no actual difference between the two rides.
The explosion of the American carousel meant lots of competition. This led to the development of different styles that can still be found today. It's important to remember that up until very recently, all carousels featured wooden horses, which required hundreds to thousands of hours of work from skilled craftsmen, meaning that these rides are often seen as art pieces. This unfortunately has had some negative effects that we'll talk about later. Denzel's company would develop the first subcategory of carousel style, known as Philadelphia style. Carousels in the Philadelphia style are known to have animals with lots of realism and detail. Carousel manufacturers Philadelphia Toboggan Company, E. Joy Morris, D.C. Muller, and Denzel were some of the primary producers of rides in this style. The next style was pioneered by Charles Loof at Coney Island. This style, known as the Coney Island style, is known for being the most flamboyant, with horses and other animals being decorated in glass jewels and gold leafing. Some examples of rides in this style even feature horses with electric lights embedded in them. Finally, we have County Fair style. This style was created by builders in North Tonawanda, New York. In the early 1900s, the area had become a hub for traveling carousel manufacturing, with Armitage Herschel, Herschel Spillman, and Alan Herschel building rides in this area. County fair-style carousel animals are designed primarily for travel. They lack the heavy details that the other styles possess.
Over time, all carousel horses have a tendency to become less detailed. When they are originally carved, they're filled with tons of intimate details added by master craftsmen. But over time, they get painted with what's called park paint. This is paint applied by a parks maintenance team and usually is of much less quality and much less intricate design than they were originally carved.
Though we have now described the most popular version of the carousel, innovation did not stop. In the early 1920s, a racing version of the carousel was created by the company Pryor & Church. This ride featured a new wheel and rail mechanism underneath the platform that moved the horses back and forth to simulate racing. These rides also ran faster than normal carousels. 3 of these rides still exist today, with one at Cedar Point, one at Blackpool Pleasure Beach, and one at Rye Playland. All 3 installations of the ride that remain are mostly true to their original design and are a significant part of carousel history. As time continued, the high skill required to carve carousel horses began to limit their production and increase costs. This became a serious problem during the Great Depression, and it spurred innovation. Alan Herschel invented the half-wood, half-metal carousel animals in this time. These would have wooden bodies that were simple to carve, with metal legs and heads. By the 1950s, new carousels were made entirely out of metal. Alan Herschel's company would be bought by Chance Rides in this time, and a new company, Aero Development, yes, that Aero, started making metal carousels. In the 1960s, a man named Dave Bradley started experimenting with fiberglass, casting his carousel horses to make copies. Chance picked up this idea from Bradley, getting permission to use his work. Next thing you know, fiberglass carousels became the norm. Today, many carousels have switched to fiberglass horses or animals, as it's both lighter and easier to maintain. This is the case for the armored horse on the Kitty Kingdom Carousel at Cedar Point. The story of this machine is quite interesting, as it is a Denzel machine built in 1924. It ran with all wooden horses for a long time, even having its armored horse featured on a 1988 series of postage stamps featuring carousel horses. Of all the horses featured, the only horse still on an operating ride was the one at Cedar Point. That led the city of Sandusky to hold a gathering to celebrate the stamps.
They decided to hold this gathering at what was, at the time, an abandoned post office in downtown Sandusky. They hoped that 200 people would show up, when in reality 2,000 showed up. After this, a nonprofit was formed and the Merry-Go-Round Museum would become a permanent feature of downtown Sandusky.
The Kitty Kingdom Carousel has now had its wooden armored horse replaced with a fiberglass replica. The armored horse pictured on the stamp is still at the park. It was previously held in the Town Hall Museum and is currently in storage. The advancement of fiberglass carousels did not mean the complete end for wooden carousels. Art Ritchie and Jim Jones founded Carousel Works. Carousel Works is to wooden carousels what Din is to wooden coasters, except Carousel Works are fantastic and their machines are known for their quality. Their company is credited with starting a new golden age of carousels. Carousel Works produced over 60 carousels until they closed in 2021. Almost every major zoo in America has a Carousel Works carousel. These are hand-carved wooden carousels. But the new golden age didn't just include Carousel Works. Many communities, like Sandusky, came together and started carving their own carousel animals or building their own carousels.
At the Merry-Go-Round Museum here in Sandusky, animals are still being carved today, such as this ghost over here. One of the woodcarvers is actually Paul the Woodcarver, who fans of Cedar Point know for being the Cedar Point woodcarver.
Several carousel games emerged over the years, inspired by the actual horseback riding the carousel was based on. One of these was the Brass Ring game, a game where riders are expected to reach from the ride to grab a ring. If the rider gets the brass ring, their ride is free. Knoebels actually still operates their carousel in this way. Though simple machines, carousels do have some mechanical issues that owners need to stay on top of. Bearings exist inside the center pole to allow it to rotate but not lean to one side. These can be damaged if they're not maintained or if a ride is run unbalanced frequently. Riders stepping onto or off of a carousel while it's moving can also damage these bearings. Replacing these bearings is a large process that can take days. there have been a small number of accidents associated with carousels. In 1948, at Cincinnati's Coney Island, a rider fell from a horse due to suffering from a dizzy spell on the ride. The rider would end up dying from their injuries. Another interesting accident occurred in 1919, when a barnstormer plane crash-landed on the canopy for traveling PTC Carousel number 40. The photo from after the event is quite striking, but thankfully everyone, including the pilot, walked away unharmed. This carousel, PTC number 40, was built in 1917 and is rumored to still be intact somewhere. So if you have any information, feel free to contact me or your local carousel museum. That leads me on to the next part of this video. Carousels are actually endangered, and without your support, they could disappear in the not-so-distant future. The amusement industry expanded rapidly in the US in the interwar period. After the Second World War, it began to shrink. As parks began to close and carousels were sold off, wealthy collectors began buying individual horses for their own private collections.
During the golden era of carousels, over 3,000 carousels were built. Of those, there's fewer than 150 still in existence. During that time period, as you would sit on the animals, you would rub the paint off, so maintenance guys in the park would go put new layers of paint on the pieces. It's not unheard of for carousel animals to have 20 to 30 layers of paint on them. When that happens, a lot of the details in the carvings get filled in and lost. So like any antique that is in its original paint, you do absolutely nothing to it. You ruin the value of it. However, if they've got all those layers of park paint on them and you get them properly restored, so these have all been stripped back down to their original base of raw wood, and get them properly restored, you can actually increase the value of the piece. Most carousel pieces have been restored at some point in time. Collectors can choose whether to restore them back to the original colors that were used. However, most of those pictures, if you can find one of the pieces, are in black and white, so it is extremely hard to tell what colors were actually used, so they can pretty much paint them however they want. When being restored, a lot of them will reflect the time period in which they were purchased and the artistic movement moving through homes at that point in time. As a result, a lot of carousels were dismantled and sold piece by piece, as carousel collectors could purchase a single animal for up to $1 million. When carousel operators could finance parks or their traveling circus or festival when having financial difficulties by selling off a single piece, a lot of pieces would get sold off, so carousels themselves would get broken apart over time. A movement has gone through since the 1970s trying to stop the singular sale of carousel animals as individuals and keeping entire machines as intact, as each machine has its own unique personality and a lot of memories are attached to each individual machine.
Thankfully, in the 1970s and 80s, efforts were organized to save the carousel. This included projects like opening the Merry-Go-Round Museum in Sandusky and the opening of the Carousel Museum in Bristol, Connecticut, along with several other projects. I mention both of these museums as they've both been great resources in helping with this video. Without them, this video could not have been made. If you're in the area for either museum, be sure to stop in. The museum in Sandusky is almost within view of Cedar Point, so if you visit there, you have no excuse not to stop by. Museums like both of these keep carousel history in the public view and out of private collections. Ultimately, carousel history is the history of the entire amusement industry. Without them, the amusement and theme parks of today would likely not exist as they do now. If you're a fan of the industry, you owe it to yourself to help preserve them. I personally will be spending more time helping out at the Sandusky Merry-Go-Round Museum in the future. Truthfully, there's still something special about a ride on a carousel. Thanks for watching this episode of Flat Ride Friday, and we'll see you next week.